Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. As the EU raises Chinese electric vehicle tariffs to up to nearly 50%, Beijing is retaliating with an anti-dumping investigation into EU pork imports. Will this start an EU trade war, and what are the political implications? And as the dust settles on the European Parliament's shift to the right, we ask what changes this may bring to EU policy, especially toward China and toward Taiwan. Joining us to discuss this are Herlin Chien, National Pingtung University of Science and Technology College of Humanities and Social Sciences Professor, Mathieu Duchâtel, Institut Montaigne Resident Senior Fellow and International Studies Director, and Marcin Jerzewski, European Values Centre for Security Policy Taiwan Office Head. A very warm welcome to all of you on the show today. Beijing has announced its own anti-dumping investigation, this time into European pork imports. It's a countermeasure against Brussels' decision to hike tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports to up to 48%, the result of an extensive anti-dumping probe by the EU. Pork producers in Spain, France, Germany and the Netherlands are likely to be hit the hardest. The EU is the world's second biggest pork producer behind China. EU officials say they are certain that European subsidies are in line with WTO rules. Professor Chien, what do you make of this countermeasure by Beijing?
Well, the countermeasure by Beijing is naturally the response, immediate response. But I don't think that it will be a long-term continuations in the future, because eventually a win-win strategy should be more beneficial for both the EU and the Chinese markets. And especially for the EU, in the past they have been trying to de-risking China in terms of security and the economic. But to have this kind of severe trade war is not de-risking, is actually increasing the risk. So
you think both sides will pull back?
Right, especially with this extreme right-wing victory, I think the central right party has to take consideration of a future coalition with the extreme right, and then this time the pork retaliation focus on the farmers' benefits. So one of the supporters we see this time is farmers increasing vote for the extreme right. So once that comes into the pictures, EU has to sort of balance its policy.
Mathieu, do you agree with that both sides don't want to enter this trade war, so they will be very careful, and maybe if there are any tariffs, they'll be very targeted?
Well, you could make the opposite argument that this is actually the beginning of a trade war that will further escalate. I think it's a little bit early to tell. The trade war narrative is actually a Chinese narrative to get the Europeans to stop those measures. But I think that from a European perspective, what we have seen with the anti-subsidies investigation into Chinese electric vehicles is not, the result of an intention to start a trade war with China. It's really a specific problem that the EU has with Chinese electric vehicles. And even with the increase in tariffs in Europe, the premium, that's the word used in a rhodium study, the premium is the difference between the cost of the same model on the Chinese market and on the German market, will still be quite important for Chinese exporters. So I think...
Is it more than 50%?
Well, for BYD, it's actually close to 100%, the premium, the cost difference. So that's one thing. And then regarding pork, it's true that it will hurt some categories, farmers in some EU countries. China is the #1 importer of pork products from the EU, but more than 85% of the EU's pork production is actually consumed inside Europe. And if you look at #2, #3, #4, there are Japan, the Philippines, South Korea. So it actually could be a very good incentive for European exporters to diversify.
Okay, Marcin, let's talk about, if this is the first steps of a trade war, what other products that could be drawn into this? Obviously, we know about cognac and brandy already.
I believe that it might indeed be a starting point for a trade war that will escalate, and I also think that it is really essential to not only look at the more quantitative dimension of these tariffs. Is it tit for tat? What is the exact percentage that is imposed on goods on both sides? What is crucial is to understand what types of goods are targeted here. So, for example, electric vehicles are extremely important for Europeans in terms of Europe's energy transition goals and net zero objectives. But then food products that China is targeting are also very politically influential. So it is food products and agricultural products that constitute a sector where many member states have a trade surplus with China, which cannot be said for majority of other sectors. So even if food and agricultural products or other goods that might be targeted in the future don't make up a significant portion of the total gross domestic product of the individual member states, these are very politically influential. And talking about it here in Taiwan, I think it's important to see that this modus operandi has been deployed by China, for example, vis-a-vis Taiwanese agricultural goods, also because they are so politically influential. So we should look at those categories, and I see potential for more food and agricultural products to be targeted as escalation continues.
Professor Chien, I mean, you have a slightly different view. You believe that it would be short-term measure, maybe because China understands that coming out too hard would backfire. Can you talk to us about, some of those considerations? So, for example, of course, China wants EU strategic autonomy, so it doesn't want, Europe and America to, say, align too much on say, EV tariffs.
Right. Exactly, because the European Union, even though it looked like an European integration, but it still has a lot of fragmentations. So China is trying to take advantage of those multipolarism within the EU itself. We have 27 members, where they all have different standards. Even within the extreme right, they do have their differences. So I think China was not worried too much about a very united EU, and then actually taking advantage of this fragmentations, and then as a countermeasure against the US force as well. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go into that a little bit later. Let's talk first about the results in the European Parliament. So that EU investigation and the EV tariff decision were taken before the European Parliament elections held from June 6th to 9th. In those elections, which determine the Parliament for the next 5 years to 2029, Ursula von der Leyen's right of centre European People's Party won the biggest number of seats with 190. Overall, the composition of the European Parliament has shifted to the right, with a majority 413 MEPs, or 57% of seats, representing right-wing or centre-right parties. Mathieu, let me come to you. So why are we seeing this result of a seeming shift towards the right?
Well, the first thing I would say is to quote actually European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. She said that the centre held ground. I think the coalition between the centre-left and the centre-right is still dominating the European Parliament. So from that angle, the Commission will have a strong power basis in the Parliament to implement an agenda in continuity with the agenda of the previous Commission. We'll go to the Member States later. Then I think there is a specific situation in France and in Germany with the rise of the far right, the AfD in Germany and the RN in France, especially in France, where the first position of the far-right party has led the president to call for a snap election. But these parties will not be dominating the parliament. And in fact, the far-right parties in the European Parliament are not fully united on a set of public policy goals. There is fragmentation in the far right. So if you look only at the parliament, at the scale of the parliament, I think the key story is that the center is indeed holding ground.
So you disagree with the analysis that it's shifting to the right, that there's more representation of parties on the right than there are on the left?
Well, I think the rise of the far right, especially in France, may have a strong impact on some aspects of policy making in the EU. But I think that will be about the dynamic between the member states and the Commission, rather than the dynamic between the Parliament and the Commission, because that's the way the European Union is functioning. The member states are still in the leading position when it comes to pushing for specific policy agendas.
So what you're saying is, other than France and Germany, you don't see much change?
Well, I see indeed, I see big change in those countries. I see that in Italy, the far right is also very high, but you know that the far right in France and the far right in Germany are not sitting in the same group in the European Parliament. They may ally on some specific issues, but they will not be able to use their position of power in the Parliament to push for a strong common agenda. This will happen at the level of member states and national governments.
Okay, so talking of common agendas, let's address China policy. So the Nikkei has said that the biggest problem facing, Marcin, the EU, is the growing differences between the 27 member states on how to deal with China. So can you talk to us about what you believe the different approaches are, if indeed we can talk about them, to categorize, centre, left and right with regard to perhaps trade and China?
I believe that there is a lot of heterogeneity between different member state level parties that then form these three categories of groups in the European Parliament. So in that sense, I can only echo Mathieu's remarks that the far right is not a homogeneous group, and neither are the center parties, and neither is the left. But one thing that we are seeing across European Union institutions is indeed the attempt to redefine the European relationship with China, and there are many ideas around that. With the results of the European Parliament elections, I think it's crucial to emphasize that while with the larger numbers of members on the right, it might be difficult to push for new groundbreaking policy solutions, I don't see much potential for backsliding. So we can zoom in once again at processes with regard to shaping the EU-China relations that are already in place. For example, importantly, within the context of the common security and defense policy, the European Union published its first ever common threat assessment in the shape of the strategic compass released shortly after the onset of the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. And the second common threat assessment, building upon the strategic compass, is due in 2025. One of the biggest criticisms of the strategic compass is that it didn't really give enough weight to threats in the Indo-Pacific region and threats originating from China, but I think that it is very likely that the role of China will be re-emphasized in the next year's threat assessment, also given the growing recognition within the European Union of the growing confluence of strategic interests between Moscow and Beijing. So these processes are continuing, we are on track, and there was a tilt to the right in the European Parliament as a result of the elections, sure, but it wasn't a tectonic shift.
Okay. Professor Chien, let's I want to see if we can answer the question, perhaps we cannot, given the answer so far, whether it's a good thing for China that there is a tilt, let's call it a tilt towards the far right in the European Parliament, also in the major players, France and Germany, as Mathieu said. Given that ideologically they should be more aligned with authoritarian China.
Well, ideologically, yes. But the key issue here, I think, is still focusing on the economies. And then also, if, given the fragmentation of the European Union politics right now, I think it's a big beneficial for China to go ahead for more bilateral trade agreement, maybe, between different member states and China. So I see it as an opportunity for Chinese to move forward to more one-to-one countries, bilateral agreements, and then...
Would they be open to that, though?
Well, if that is the solution for the current trade war, I don't think why isn't that becoming an options for both China and then other member states if they cannot get a consensus in the European Union.
Okay. Mathieu, you mentioned the French decision by French President Emmanuel Macron to call that snap election. Many people are scratching their heads about why he did that. I want to quote something that he said. He said, you know, I guess to reply to the critics within his own, perhaps even in his own office or party, there may be personal ambitions that have been thwarted by the current changes, but it's not important. We are facing a historic moment for the nation. You know, as a Frenchman yourself, do you think he made the right decision?
That's a very difficult question to answer, especially as the outcome of this snap election is very uncertain. What is clear is that the French society, the political system in France, is now divided in three forces, far left, far right, and a kind of central middle, which is shrinking. Macron has won past election in the middle, taking votes away from the traditional right and from the Socialist Party, but his space has been shrinking, and I think that he has made the assessment that after the summer, by September, October, he would be in a very difficult position to rule, and his government may face in Parliament a vote of no confidence. He speeded up a process that many of his advisors apparently thought was kind of certain towards the end of the year, that there would be a dissolution of the National Assembly. But the result of this election may lead him to actually be in a very difficult position to govern this country.
And how do you think things may turn out in the legislative elections? What do you think the result, you know, the best outcome for him would be?
The best outcome for him would be for his bloc to turn up in the first position. It seems very unlikely. It also seems unlikely that any party will get an absolute majority. And France does not have a tradition of building up coalitions for ruling, unlike Germany. And the fact that the three blocs are not only, you know, deeply divided on almost everything, even though there are similarities on some policy issues between the far right and the far left, I find it very hard to imagine how the executive branch will be able to work with the legislative branch going forward. And the rule of the French Constitution is that the National Assembly can be dissolved only once a year. So if the outcome of this election is, you know, three blocs, no clear majority, we may enter a period of instability for a year.
I'm sorry to stay on you, but because I want to ask about the policy toward China,
Yes.
of the left, the right, and the centre. Is it a consensus?
Well, the first thing is that it did not play out in the campaign at all, because the divisive issues in French politics are Ukraine and Gaza/Israel. That's very clear. The only party that really mentioned China in the campaign is actually the far left party, and they had very strong words against any French involvement in the Indo-Pacific alongside the US. I think what is remarkable, if you look at the far left and the far right in French politics on foreign policy issues, is that they have this anti-US tradition, that an ideological positioning that leads them to take some positions on various key issues. And even though the far right does not have a clear stance on China policy, I believe that the US element would be very central if they gain power in the way they would approach international politics. But at the same time, the far right is also very much about reindustrialization, national sovereignty, etc.
Marcin, in Germany, let's look at Germany. So the far right Alternative for Germany, or AfD party, moved ahead of Scholz's SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. You know, this was the worst defeat for his party since 1949, apparently. Scholz, though, defended China's electric vehicle industry, and do you think that they would prefer to deal with them, these liberal leaders, rather than, say, like Le Pen?
I believe that there might be an advantage for Beijing to dealing with these more mainstream converging towards the center leaders of Europe, such as German Chancellor Scholz. And that's because mainstream politicians bring in a sense of stability. There is already a certain continuity, institutional continuity in operations of these parties, either as ruling parties or in other configurations, opposition parties.
Is it also, though, their view about the global system, the global trading system? You know, the liberals versus the far right. The far right perhaps would be more protectionist.
The far right would be more protectionist, but importantly, the far right would also be much more inward-looking, and therefore the far right, even if it doesn't have an explicit anti-authoritarian stance due to its own tendencies, it might also be more prone to insular policies, which are not beneficial for China. Yes.
Right. Okay. Professor Chien, let's turn to Taiwan. What impact do you think the European Parliament, the new European Parliament, would have on Taiwan? Is there a connection with the right?
I think this time, this political shock of the rise of the far right might further marginalize Taiwan affair and its relation with the EU. But on the other hand, unless Taiwan can play a bigger role to help EU in terms of economy, for example, our AI industry or our semiconductor industry can be an alternative for the EU, to alternative market for the EU. On that kind of economic consideration, I think this rise of the EU might be more like internally. They have to consume a lot of those energies dealing with these new situations, and rather than paying attention to the cross-strait relation or the Taiwan issues at this moment. I will not foresee a very big change to the EU stand on Taiwan.
Okay, Mathieu, do you agree with that? No real change on Taiwan policy.
Well, I think that first, regarding the Parliament, Taiwan still has friends in Parliament, in the European Parliament, and I think that's what matters, given how European politics works. The importance of Parliament for Taiwan is to have, favorable voices that can pinpoint to the importance of Taiwan, support Taiwan on some critical policy issues, and that is not going to disappear. I think the question for Taiwan looking forward is the possibility or not to negotiate some form of trade agreement or investment protection agreement with the new European leadership. This did not happen under the outgoing Commission, and I think this issue will resurface once we have a new Commission in October, in November. I know that Taiwan will try to play that card. Will Taiwan succeed? I think it's also quite uncertain at this stage, and I would emphasize the point that member states are really the key, you need consensus among member states to push for policy issues, and member states have been very cautious when it comes to deepening trade and investment relations with Taiwan during the previous European leadership. And there, if you do have governments that are very influenced by the far right to some extent, I think the chance for Taiwan to finalize those agreements is going to decrease, actually.
Okay. Now I want to finally, Marcin, turn to the US election. So CNN saying that the European Parliament swing to the right may be a harbinger for Donald Trump's victory in November. What impact do you think the results of the European Parliament may have on the United States and vice versa?
These comments that appeared in CNN signal a high level of misunderstanding of the European electoral process, because one frequently underappreciated dimension of European elections is voter turnout, voter behavior, voter mobilization. And across 27 member states, the average turnout rate was only slightly above 51%. And the average is susceptible to outliers. For example, some member states where voting is compulsory. In those member states where citizens can choose whether they turn up to the polls or not, turnout rates are often much lower. In Central Eastern European countries, they oscillate around 30%. For example, the Czech Republic is celebrating its historically high turnout rate in European Parliament elections that barely went above 36%. This all shows that voter mobilization in European Parliament elections is an issue, and voter behavior in European Parliament elections is not really representative of broader trends of ideological changes and political participation. For example, in Lithuania, which in this election super year is really living up to having an election super year with 3 elections right one after another, presidential, European Parliament and parliamentary elections, it's the Homeland Union from the European People's Party, the Christian Democrat Party, that got the highest number of votes in the European Parliament elections, but they only poll about 3rd or 4th for the parliamentary elections. And the leader in polls ahead of parliamentary elections, the Lithuanian Farmers and Greens Association, only got the 3rd score in the European Parliament elections. So these dynamics are very different, not necessarily representative, and that's why it's hard for me to agree with this extrapolation that European Parliament elections with this tilt to the right that we talked about are a harbinger for the return of Donald Trump.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'm so sorry. Professor Herlin Chien, Mathieu Duchâtel and Marcin Jerzewski, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth. A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for Taiwan Plus.
Taiwan Plus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.